Welcome and hello to the launch of the digital essay Revisiting Bucharest. My name is Barbara Anderlic, and I will be having a brief talk with Slovene poet Uroš Prah about this digital essay he prepared for us.
Hey, Barbara. Hello.
Thank you so much for being with us. Let's just get straight into it. So when I was reading the text on the Revisiting Bucharest page, you at one point mentioned that you just kind of fell into writing, that you just kind of ended up doing it.
Yeah, I wouldn't call it I just fell into it. But definitely I just ended up doing it. I keep doing it. That would be the right thing, right way to say it. I write actually mostly poems, but also some prose since I can remember almost. I mean, definitely early primary school, I already had been writing, and it just never went away. Then I studied also philosophy and comparative literature, and somehow just kept on doing it. So that's now what I'm doing for a living. So that's what I meant, and it's just just a way of
it just came
for me how to
be
you in the world, and I can earn a little bit from it, so it can cover part of my living expenses, and everything else I arrange around it.
Coming also to speak more specifically about the poems you write, I already before we started the interview, we talked a little bit about your poetry, and I think there is obviously, I think maybe this environmental nature component to it, but I think what, especially in those poems that are on the Revisiting Bucharest page, I think there's a really kind of like sensual, erotic rawness to them that stems kind of from, I guess, very personal experiences. And those are then cast against like cityscapes or nature and stuff like that. So maybe tell us a bit more about like the other topics or themes that you explore in the poems that people can read on the page.
One of the main things I have been focused on since very early on is soil, exposed soil, eroding soil, soil of open pit mines, devastated soil. That somehow always was very, I mean, I have quite an intimate, I would say, relationship towards it since childhood times. I would say I grew up in a little village and spent a lot of time digging in dirt and in the forests around it and in hills and with the river there and so on. And so this certain eroticism of or eros, at least, of being in those places, experiencing them, losing yourself in them, so to speak, is inherent in my work, I would say, since forever. And especially during the course of my writing, it turned out that I was less and less putting these personal experiences, either of myself or other people, humans especially, in the focus, but more so the main subjectivity of the poems became those phenomena like this exposed soil and so on. And the people, the lyric I or we or so on, the humans, animals, things that inhabit like the edges of those spaces are my focus as well. So it's this dynamic between trying to find a language where to imagine this subjectivity of this phenomena and the relationship of beings inhabiting it. Now, the beings that are on those edges are beings that are anyway on the edges of society or of, that are marginalized. I myself am gay, and so it's a queer, definitely a queer aspect that's very important. Working class people, migrant people, people who inhabit those places factually in our societies, in our geography, that are pushed towards these spaces that are most vulnerable to environmental changes and have the most intense relationships to an environment changing. Something I would say I experienced since forever as well. So, as I said, as I write since forever, I also experienced that since forever, because in this little village where I grew up on the border between Austria and Slovenia, it was, I mean, I was born 88, so a few years before Yugoslavia fell apart. And there was like a semi-hot border between, and our house is right next to the border, next to the River Mura, next to a border crossing. And so there was a lot of societal problems were pushed to those other edges of the country. Like I mean, immediately above our house was it's a huge castle in which there was an institution for the mentally and neurologically ill, where the worst cases of Slovenian psychiatry were put in permanently, and it was like a huge thing. Hundreds of people living there, while in the village itself only a few 10 people lived. Or this halt border where there was some smuggling going on. If you would be playing too close to the river, you might get reprimanded by the authorities. Or so an experience of very intense inhabiting of this marginal spaces that are at the same time very freeing, but at the same time lots of weird societal and environmental disintegration happening in those spaces. Like the River Mura was quite polluted back then. Now it's a bit cleaner. So, you know, the idea of touching it would be, now you can dabble your feet inside. But environmental, societal, and economic devastation is in this transitional era from Yugoslavia into Slovenia was something I experienced very personally and on my body, in my mind, and so it has stayed a focus for me since then. So I always think those things that maybe don't seem so close, like eroticism, queer eroticism, and so on, and environmental questions, for me, they're intimately
connected. Okay, maybe you can tell us a bit about the delta you discovered when you were in Bucharest, because it's also a very focal point of Revisiting Bucharest, the digital essay.
Bucharest is part of the city, and in the late 80s, as much of Bucharest, Ceausescu's regime started to demolish whole swaths of the city to build huge new projects, and Bucharest was one of those. Houses were demolished and the people resettled and so on. And the main thing, the biggest thing that was meant to be built there was a giant artificial lake or water reservoir. The whole area was raised, then a concrete border was built, and the idea was to fill it with water, which it never came to fruition because the regime fell, and the work stopped and started to sink, which a lot of Bucharest is doing, and it developed into a marshy place, and it's quite an unreal space in the midst of this huge city. It feels like something that shouldn't be there. I mean, in the middle of the city, of course. You immediately are surrounded by the lack of things you imagined could be there. But it developed into a really, really rich, I mean, one of the most diverse, biodiverse places in Romania now. This devastation, the historical, the urbanistic devastation, at the same time, the natural abundance, only made possible by the lack of people. All of that is intrinsically speaks to what we were describing before. It caters to all the interests.
It caters to all the boxes that need to be ticked.
What are my main drivers for writing? And so it became an important part of my writing about Bucharest, from Bucharest, and I took many pictures and so on, and it all came into this, fused into this project now.
I really have to say that, again, like the digital essay, you really see that, like, again, you're like immersed into the way you arrived at the city, the way you experienced the city. And I think, again, I can just also tell the audience, like, I think it just like go on the page, really look at the photographs, and then like find out about the delta and all of these things, because I think they're really very interesting. And I think there's the writer Kapka Kasabova, who like wrote this very interesting book, Border, about the border region between Turkey, Bulgaria, and Greece. And I think at one point she really, during an interview, said, you know, there's places that are always written about, like New York, London, like they're almost overwritten, whereas there's so many pockets in the world that like are kind of undiscovered. So it's really interesting that you kind of like bring it to the forefront of like your writing for Revisiting Bucharest. I really enjoyed it, I have to say.
Thank you. I would even say, you know, like you mentioned London and New York, like overwritten cities. Yeah, but at the same time, those places have a lot of marginal spaces as well that are.
That is true. That is true.
When I was in New York last year, I also the residency. The places that were most interesting to me were, again, I don't know, some weird industrial wastelands on Staten Island and so on, and people living on the edges of that. So I would say these border regions are everywhere.
Of course, yeah, definitely, yeah. Like even in Vienna, there's places that like, I mean, I think, yeah, I guess there's also almost like a tourist version of cities that we find in books and literature, where like, you know, the same themes are kind of explored. Whereas definitely like there's also, even in bigger cities that, you know, that figure very prominently in literature, there's obviously nooks and crannies that very rarely get exposed by writers or authors. That's for sure, yeah.
The supply chains connecting city to its edges or nature are very quick today in the globalized economy, very impactful, and we live very much all the time in these places already. I mean, you know, as you, I cannot stop thinking about, I don't know, people in Vienna, like my neighbors, using wooden pallets to heat their cities, houses, thinking, well, it's a good version to do it, but it's actually, a lot of it is illegally sourced Romanian wood, for example, of protected primeval forests. Those connections are not something I can forget about. They occupy my mind almost too much all the time, to a point where I sometimes feel debilitated a little bit, and then unable to act or be or write. And these problems are something I try to write about, of course, as well.
And again, I have to say, you write about it very beautifully. So again, to the audience watching and everyone else, please check out the page. Also, you probably know that like the time hasn't been the easiest for writers or bookstores or other places that are dealing with culture currently, or like that are dabbling in it. So if, for example, any of you has the means to in any way like help with that, there's always, ways of supporting, your local bookstore or something else. Uroš, thank you again for being with us today. It was really lovely. And for the people watching, stay tuned, because after this interview finishes, we will see some clips of Uroš reading some of his poems in Slovene.
Yeah, and the translations you can read on the site.
Exactly, the translations you can read on the page. And yeah, so thank you for watching. Stay well and visit or revisit Bucharest. All the best.
Svetlobe seveda preveč, a zatemnitev ni nobena rešitev tudi. Laž. Luči ni preveč na robu Vakareštija, na toplem betonskem naklonu, na kar sonce pade, hlad groz gozda, ko si bil majhen, preden si se 17 nočnimi vstopi van prisilil, da ti je postal tudi v temi domač. Tudi če to tu ni hosta, ni park, kaj sploh je? Spodletel rezervoar, pepeljena zgodovina, posedena v pol močvirje, v pol savano sprijeta, rečejo delta. Uradno rezervat. Česa? Posegov recimo. Ptic. In morda še tipov, ki kruzajo. Najbolje je povsod tam, kjer bi moral res vedeti, da je nekaj bilo, pa ne. Nedavne groze ni več čutiti. Je pa čuden ta kraj, domač v kompozicijah svojega rastja. Redkih poti, še redkejših objektov. Si že šlačiš majico na betonu, se že zadnjemu soncu nastavljaš. V mestih me pogosto v zelene, kar se da divje zaplate zanese, kjer med trstičjem pomislim na objeto noč, v kateri sva predvsem tvoj trd teden odspala, na kar si mi ga zjutraj povlekel, vidim. Tvoja izbira početi vse to podplačano komunikativno delo je v skladu s tvojim karakterjem, seveda si, kot kdo pa ne, naklonjen svoj podobi, ampak predvsem moraš dati. Sem pa pravzaprav drugo hotel. Spet vem, ko med trstičem v tem ali v onem mestu na nek topel sončen dan septembra, oktobra, morda maja poiščem, ne zaidem, sem rekel pač na neko majhno potko, ki se mi kavno vija v goščavo in obljublja. Dom, daljavo, mir, žival, jaso, skalo. In se točno tam za hip na tvoja tiča polna usta spomnim, zlezem do te ali te razgledne točke nekje na robu parka zaščitenega območja, nekoliko dlje ob obali, naletim. Pogosto naletim na prvega tipa, ki se nemirno obrača na dva več, starejše, večinoma verne, tudi revne, kdaj prej poslovne gejše, kar izberejo najlepše kraje, ljubujejo času, ljubkujejo, so kot ti kraji sami, ti kraji živčni, so ti kraji, umirjeni hkrati na preži, pač ljubeče loveči zgolj bitja, ki pristanejo. Bokoliki prizori skoraj preglašeni od prometne 8-pasovnice nekaj metrov stran, varno odmaknjeni nad družinskim življem na urejenih poteh ob jezeru, močvirju ribniku reki, prizori šetajočih se gospodov iz pisarn hrib prihajajočih, od zgodnjih kosil ali spavališča spodaj ob vodi, utirajoč vse te elegantno prepredene potke, sedeč zgoraj brez na zložljivem stolu sredi drobne jase, spomenujoč me na to, odkot sam prihajam, kažoč na dejstvo, da se moje telo ježi ob šelestenju trstičja, napenja pod soncem, ki skozi redko listje prodira, se v vodi poteguje vase, se suho, prašno, zemljo spari. Hvala.